In this video, I'm going to cover all of the power systems that would be considered available to off-grid homesteaders, so no RTGs or geothermal systems. We're going to divide these systems into two categories, passive and active, and I'll explain why we need both. Including active systems can be a cheaper alternative to needlessly overbuilding your system. There's not really a need to accommodate for rare and extreme load cases, whether that be a PV array so big that it can fast charge your Tesla on a winter solstice, or a battery bank that is so large you can run your entire house for a week with no input. I hope this video will help you out a bit when you're designing your own system. So first, our active sources. Here are the systems that I would say run on refined fuel, that being diesel, gas, and propane. And then there's the systems that run on unrefined fuel, such as steam, Stirling engines, and Thermoelectrics. Plus, I'm going to throw in miscellaneous human power and animal power. For passive, we have photovoltaic, wind, thermal, and microhydro. Let's get started. Let's go over the merits of utilizing a generator. When living off-grid, you grow to appreciate what a generator provides pretty quickly. Generators provide a huge amount of power on demand with no spool-up time. They really are the forbidden fruit, and it's easy to feel dirty or defeated when using one. But still, they are a no-nonsense power system that you can run hard and put away wet. No worries about hooking it up to a large, dirty, inductive load, unlike that sensitive inverter that sometimes makes weird sounds when doing the same thing. However, they are still not meant to be your primary source of power. If you make your own fuel, they're still costly to run, so be sure to take that into account. So why even bother? Well, there are periods of time when you're going to run in a power deficit, either a big construction project, or say your rich uncle shows up with his Tesla at 10% battery life and doesn't understand that his Type 2 charger uses more power than your entire house. There could be weather or storms that could reduce your yield for a while. There's also seasonal issues, where you might find that it's easier to run your generator for a few months in December and January than it is to install a larger array. You're going to have to do this math yourself and see where the break-even point is and how this all maps out. Or you could have a trip or failure and run the generator as a backup until the situation is resolved. There's also maintenance on your system, which could be reconditioning your batteries with a nice full charge cycle, or you need to maintain your system for a while and take it offline, and you're going to be running the generator to power the house. Be sure to weigh these costs of running a generator versus building a larger or more redundant system in your own case. So diesel generators, these are typically the go-to backup for industry, but how does that translate over to our smaller scale operations like our house and homestead? Here we are assuming that you aren't buying a 10 grand plus 20 to 30 kW unit. We're looking into smaller units that would be more approachable. So let's look into it. Well, the appeal of diesel is that it's efficient, right? Well, sadly, these attributes don't always scale down. The fuel economy of smaller diesels isn't really remarkable, and diesel generators of this size tend to be on par with their gasoline counterparts. The reality of this can be seen in the apparent gap in the market. There are very few generators available below 10 kilowatts or 10 horsepower, depending on how you want to measure it. These few offerings tend to be pretty pricey as well, about 4 times or more the price of the equivalent gasoline generator. Maybe it's because of limited demand and there's no economies of scale, but I haven't really found an off-the-shelf generator that is diesel-powered that is outperforming a gasoline equivalent both in economics and fuel consumption. So why would you want to get one of these? Well, if you can get one for cheap, and largely I'd say that'd be in an auction or a surplus. Maybe if you want a very large 20 kilowatt plus power station, then go you if you want to go that big. And here's the only reason I think I'd ever really want to get one is because if you're trying to brew a liquid biofuel like biodiesel, you'll probably have more success with a diesel engine than a gasoline engine. Gasoline engines can be kind of finicky when it comes to their liquid fuel, so if you're looking for creating a crude, liquid, burnable fuel, you're probably going to have more success with a diesel-based engine than a gasoline engine. And lastly, the light use on a homestead will probably lead to a very long lifetime for these diesel engines, which are already known for lasting a very long time anyway. So if you really want to get one, looking to see if you can find one for cheap, brew some biodiesel for it, and it should have a long life ahead of it. Gasoline-powered units are fairly cheap and easy to get. They are also available at many different power outputs. This is important with regards to fuel efficiency and performance. The sizing of a generator and whether or not it's an inverter generator or a conventional generator will be discussed in a future video. Remember that for most gas generators, they are not meant to run for long-term and/or continuous runs. Yet given how we illustrated the use cases for generators on a homestead, this should not be a problem. Still, be aware of this limitation. The main perks of gas generators is that there are many affordable auto start models available. These are really nice, that way you don't wear out your arm, and you can set up the system to start automatically in the event of a trip. Also, there are many dual fuel models out there. Most of them are propane and gas. Be aware that propane will usually always be more expensive in all aspects, but it is nice to have that option. Also, a propane dual fuel model can be helpful if you're trying to start a stubborn cold generator. Gas generators are also good candidates for gasification. When you want to synthesize or brew your own biofuel or synthetic fuel alternative, gasoline can be really difficult to nail down. So usually you're better off with gasification. Gasification is a neat hack for running a gasoline generator with very few modifications off of wood or a similar feedstock. I'll cover gasification and hopefully a gasification project in a future video as well. Alright, and here we are at propane. Now, propane is an interesting one because propane is usually advertised as the diesel backup equivalent for households. You see Generac units which are tied to a propane tank, and this is assumed to be the better alternative to a diesel generator if you want a backup power supply for your house. Now, propane is very good at doing this, but it costs you. The thing about propane that makes it really good for a backup situation is, one, that fuel tends to not put much of a fuss up when it comes to starting. If I have issues with my dual fuel platform, usually I would start it on propane, then switch it over to gasoline, because that propane is pretty much a guaranteed start every time. The other side of this is that propane is much more stable than liquid fuels. When it's sealed in a tank, you don't have to worry about adding stabilizer or the fuel going bad or water getting in there. Pretty much, once that propane tank is set, that fuel is going to be pretty good for the next 20 years. Sounds great and all until you consider the fact of how much these systems cost, the cost to install the tank, and after all that, you're still paying for propane, which compared to the other fuels has the highest price per BTU of energy in it, or kilowatt hour, or however you want to do it. Propane, you pay for the privilege of working with such a easy to work with fuel. So really the big advantage here is having the peace of mind that when you're away and you have a backup generator set on an automatic trip to turn on if there's an issue with your inverter or your battery, you know that propane generator is most likely going to start without any fuss. Lastly, diesel and gas do hold an advantage over propane in that you can refill them easily after business hours. This may not be a big deal for many of you, but the idea of being able to drive to a gas station at 2 a.m. on a Sunday and being able to refill a jerry can to get your house up and running, it has some merit in my head. Refilling propane tanks usually will either be a scheduled affair or require some kind of staff or employee at a hardware store during business hours. Additionally, gas and diesel units are better candidates for biofuel, where a propane generator will typically be too valuable and too risky to try to convert it to run on anything else other than propane. So Steam, I'm going to tell you right up front, I'm a pretty big fan of Steam. I've been using live Steam for a long time. I don't expect this to be a pretty popular subject for a lot of people. It's kind of an oddball, but for those of you that are still listening, let's get into it. So Steam is very tempting because it creates this allure of maybe I can get more out of my firewood than just heat. So when I mention steam, I'm referring to reciprocating steam engines and turbines alike, so I'm going to lump those two together. And I'll tell you right now, good luck finding a steam turbine of the proper size to run your house. So using steam as a power source is easier said than done. The first thing that needs to get out of the way is that steam is incredibly dangerous. It combines the dangers of a pneumatic system and a hydraulic system. You can think of steam as spring-loaded heat. Also, good equipment is hard to find. You're going to be looking through antiques for the most part, and also maybe a handful of new commissions out there. It's going to be pricey, it's going to be pretty obscure. The other thing to be aware of is that firing a boiler is not as simple as running a wood stove. It's a much more involved process. And for the most part, the entire premise of using steam in an off-grid or homestead sense is you're trying to take a low-grade fuel, like wood, that is abundant and convert it into something more useful. Now, running a boiler on low-grade fuel like wood is tricky. You're trying to maintain a consistent and predictable thermal output. So you don't just build a big fire, set it and forget it. It requires constant attention. And there's also a pretty big warm-up period to get one of these things running. If you really know what you're doing, you might be able to get it done in a half hour. Otherwise, you're going to be building that head of steam for a while and then trying to maintain it with checking on it about every 15 minutes. Likely this steam boiler, steam engine setup will belong in its own structure, whether it's a barn, an outbuilding, or some other structure. It's not going to be tied to your main house, it's just too dangerous. And if you choose to go this route, be sure to do your research, be sure to figure out how to run one of these things safely. I'm probably going to make an entire series about how to do this later, but just it's not as simple as you think. And when we get down to the brass tacks, to make this worth your while, you want to get a steam system that can produce a continuous output north of 2 kilowatts to make it worth your while. And that's going to be around a 3 to 4 horsepower engine minimum. And just be aware that everyone's going to be laughing at you until it hits the fan. Then you'll become very popular very quickly because steam, once you figure out all the kinks, is a reliable power source that can run continuously with an abundant fuel supply. Stirling engines. Stirling engines are neat. They remove a lot of the issues with steam. Pretty much they remove the steam. They use air as the working fluid, although helium and hydrogen are better. They're still very expensive and hard to source and low power. I have a lot of hope for this market. I hope that there's going to be more units available that start to get into the couple 100-watt range for a wood stove, something you can just plop on a wood stove and it produces 100 watts. But for right now, we're still in an area in which there's not much interest and not much development in this area. As you've seen from those listings, they are kind of pricey and mostly novelties that can be shown off, but nothing really practical. Hopefully something useful will materialize in this space. So Thermoelectrics, good news. No moving parts to wear out, but a lot of parts that can melt. And guess what? Completely horrible, terrible efficiency. Worse than steam, worse than Stirling. Usually under 10%, and you might start flirting with 9 or 8% with very, very high-end chips that are only available in labs. Thermoelectrics require a very high thermal delta to work, and it's usually above what most would consider safe for a wood stove, around 800 degrees. They're also the most expensive per watt. I'd be hoping for a $1,000 system that can produce 500 plus watts. Right now there are $1,500 systems that produce 100 watts. I have a lot of hope for this area as well. I think it'll catch on more than Stirling, but we need to get the efficiency up and the price down. Miscellaneous human and animal power. So whether it's a human hamster wheel or a hand crank generator, even a bicycle generator, put a dynamo on your Peloton. Why aren't gyms power stations? Seriously, people pay money to spin a bike in a sweatshop. Why are we not harvesting this? Don't believe me? Look up a dog called the Turnspit. We're converting low-grade biomass into electricity. Sidestep the steam engine and use a biomechanical 2 or 4-legged energy converter. So we've covered all the active power sources. I hope I did a good job in laying out the fundamental advantages and disadvantages of all the sources mentioned. At the end of the day, I imagine most of you guys are going to be looking for a tried and true system to be your backup backbone, and maybe a secondary, more eccentric system to play around with. This video is already getting a bit long, so we're going to be covering all the passive sources in part 2. Other than that, leave your grievances in the suggestion box below, and please pay your respects to the algorithm.